Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to the NUS Baba House. I'm Danielle, Assistant Manager here, and we are happy that you're able to join us today. The talk that you've signed up to attend this afternoon is the final segment of the Present Past Heritage Conservation Speaker Series. This series was devised to investigate the many ways in which the past and the present form a dialectical relationship, creating new significances within public and personal memory. Policy, participation, documentation, and art function as lenses which unveil the economies of heritage conservation and management and their impacts on the individual and their communities. Over the weeks, we hope you've learned more about topics related to heritage in Singapore and the wider region. This series also leads up to the APRU University Museum's Research Symposium on Architectural Heritage that the NUS Baba House is hosting at the end of the year. For this week's talk, it is a pleasure to welcome Dr. Eric Kirk, who will round off the series with his presentation on the interdisciplinary nature of heritage, looking into the research he conducted at the Asia Research Institute into digital law and photogrammetry. Together with French new media artist Olivier Perriquet, their project reterritorializes Haw Par Villa as a photogrammetrical object and technological innovation in digital and virtual heritage. So with this case study, it also provides an opportunity to reflect on digital heritage beyond preservation, recollection, and agency. So a bit about the speaker today. Dr. Eric Kirk is a lecturer at the National University of Singapore. Having originally trained as a lawyer in Scotland, he moved into philosophy and today writes on how technologies organize our everyday lives, beliefs, and experiences. He has published in venues such as First Monday, Information, Communication and Society, the Information Society, Philosophy and Technology, Society in Space, East Asian Science, Technology and Society, Philosophical Issues, and The Conversation. Eric is Associate Editor at Social Epistemology, a journal of knowledge, culture, and policy. I'll now pass the time over to Dr. Kerr now, who will begin his sharing. Thank you so much.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you to Baba House and to NUS and to Danielle for moderating this talk. It's a shame that I cannot speak in person, of course, and I'd love to be at Baba House, which is such a great example of architectural and cultural conservation. But it's possibly also appropriate that we are communicating via digital technologies and some of us via avatars and I cannot see the participants for this talk, as I'll be speaking about some examples of translating or transporting a physical place or culture into a digital or virtual world. As Danielle said, this talk is about two projects. It's a digital folklore or lore, as I would rather call it, and photogrammetry. And the question is, several questions. What is preserved in that transportation into a digital space? Should anything be preserved? And how might it change in that process? So I'm going to talk about two projects that I've been involved with over the last few years that in different ways touch upon these questions. So please excuse this for being a little bit autobiographical. I'll spend about half of the time on each project. One was on digital folklore, digital cultures, and the other is a collaboration that I've had with French artist Olivier Perriquet for a number of years now, which uses a digital technique, this digital photogrammetry, to create models or images of different elements of, in this case, Haw Par Villa, as pictured in this slide here, and around which we have a series of ongoing conversations, and we're writing dialogues and reflections as part of this art philosophical collaboration. This project has received funding from the National Centre for Cinema and the Moving Image which is an agency of the French Ministry of Culture, and from the Asia Research Institute at NUS. So I'd like to thank both of those institutions for their support along the way. And I'd also like to start by declaring that, as was probably indicated in Danielle's introduction, I'm very much an outsider to heritage conservation. It's the theme of this lecture series. It's not my area of research, so I hope to not make any glaring blunders about the field of heritage studies, but please educate me if I do. As Danielle mentioned, I'm a philosopher by training. Particularly, my work is focused on the philosophy of technology and how we use technology in the production of knowledge. I've also worked in science and technology studies, which is an interdisciplinary research field that, among other things, studies the relationship between technology and culture. And in recent years, I've become very interested in digital culture. And I'll speak about that work and its relation to digital folklore and heritage in the first part of this talk. So the first project I want to speak about involved me and some other collaborators from NUS, from NTU, from MIT, some other universities around the world. Our topic was digital folklore, or as we later termed it, internet life and lore in Southeast Asia. And this involved studies in various countries in Southeast Asia into the way in which internet cultures were developing and shaping society, and how digital culture circulated and invented new stories, narratives, and what we might call folklore. So what do we mean by that word folklore? There is something anachronistic about it, I think. Does it really mean anything today? Is it the right word to use? And perhaps another question that emerges is, isn't it a little bit oxymoronic to talk about digital folklore, to oppose something that we associate with pre-modern myths and legends with computerization, with digitization? One possible reason to embrace this term is that it can be fruitful to clash two seemingly opposite ideas together. Sometimes one finds that they are not as opposed as one initially thought. And sometimes new, better terms emerge from a kind of irreconcilable difference between two modes of thought. And I hope to describe how folklore is not something that only applies to pre-modernity. It's very much part of our everyday lives, and that it can be a useful way to describe particular shifts in digital culture that may have some import for heritage studies. So, starting with that word folklore, it was originally coined by William John Thomas, the English antiquarian. Up until that point, another term had been in common currency, popular antiquities. So I have some old books which are called things like Observations on Popular Antiquities. That book in particular is subtitled Chiefly Illustrating the Origins of Our Vulgar Customs, Ceremonies and Superstitions. And as you might expect, it contains descriptions of social customs, marriage ceremonies, funeral customs, drinking customs, popular beliefs and superstitions, as well as fairy tales and fables and parables. These all get lumped together as belonging to the same kind of stuff. And from about the middle of the 19th century in Europe, folklorists began to collect and publish folk stories. Perhaps the most famous European folklorists are the Brothers Grimm, pictured here, who popularized traditional oral tales such as Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, and so on. And according to Somanaf Dar, who was writing in a mostly pre-digital era, folklore is, quote, the voices of the folk, dealing generally with their unrecorded traditions, or as a generic term to designate the customs, beliefs, traditions, tales, songs, and so on that have been handed down from generation to generation. So we're talking about the voices of the folk, unrecorded traditions, stories passed on through spoken word, or what is called oral narration. As the name implies, oral narration encompasses two things. Oral means that it is spoken or sung rather than being written down. And for most of history, of course, stories were spoken rather than written. For example, poets would need to memorize sometimes thousands of lines so that they could recite them. And narration means that it involves a story, and therefore probably those elements of storytelling such as plot, character, place, and so on. And this also means that it excludes other forms of non-narrative speech. I mentioned earlier that I find the term folk a little problematic, or I prefer to drop it. Folklore seems wrapped up in a particular, often nationalistic imagination of who the folk are. And this seems irrelevant, inappropriate to digital culture, which so clearly and seamlessly transgresses national boundaries and other geographical contexts. Originally, the word folk applied only to rural, frequently poor, frequently illiterate peasants. But it's worth considering where it came from and recognizing that it is still used by academics today to mean something that can be quite specific. So a more contemporary definition of folk is a social group which includes two or more persons with common traits, who express their shared identity through distinctive traditions. And according to this work or this research, it is the stories, the narrations, the traditions, the activities shared by the or a folk. Folklore can encompass narrations of all kinds, so epic poetry, legends, sagas, ballads, even jokes. There are more contemporary forms as well, such as the urban legend, which is a type of legend. A legend is a folk tale that is told as though the teller believes it to be true. And urban legends are legends which are told about our contemporary society. And these often express the fears or anxieties of contemporary existence. Folkloric jokes are more extended humorous stories and will typically contain more than just a gag or a punchline. They will involve a point, a kernel of truth. So folklore has a relation to the truth that is worth exploring. I think when many of us initially hear the word folklore, we think of it as something that is mythological, and we think of the mythological as something which is false. But a lot of folklore aims to communicate a truth, whether it's a moral one or a historical one, whatever else it might be. And the final important thing to note is that folklore has a continuity over time and through space. So I spoke a moment ago about folklore being an oral narration. It's stories that are passed on through the act of being spoken. And today, of course, a lot of folklore is written down. As I mentioned, about the middle of the 19th century, folklorists began to collect and publish folk stories in a concerted manner. And writing those stories down sometimes meant that there was a standard or canonical version that emerged. With other kinds of folklore, there is no canonical version, but there are versions, or what are called variants. So, for example, a folk tale that only existed in people telling it in person initially, Snow White, gets collected and published by the Brothers Grimm. It later becomes adapted for animation by Disney, turned into many films and TV series, and even into fan fiction, which could then later be adapted into a film. So, for example, 50 Shades of Grey was originally a fan fiction series based on the Twilight universe. So characters in a story that are told in a novelistic, in a film in this case, became novelized, and then a film was made which dramatically transformed those characters. And in these kinds of processes, the plot may get renewed with new characters. The character of Snow White, for example, may leave its original universe and appear in other folktales. The question arises, why are folktales and folklore so prevalent? Why do we tell folktales? And why do they occur across societies and across history? Many of these narratives are preserved for perhaps thousands of years. And scholars typically cite some or all of these and also serve a pedagogical purpose. Its purpose is to inculcate morals, to tell others what is or isn't appropriate within a group or society. And relatedly, it may be to explain or to justify punishments, comeuppance, a rehabilitation, to warn against hubris and so on. And to provide cautionary tales and to exert social pressure over certain actions and activities. So for example, the Boy Who Cried Wolf both exemplifies the fears and anxieties of a group and acts as a warning as to how members of that group are meant to behave. Folklore consequently might create a sense of shared values within a group, especially when stories are told and retold over generations, and it may validate or justify those values and traditions. Finally, and not least importantly, folklore scholars suggest that it can provide a form of escapism, and who doesn't need that? So we might think, for example, of tall tales as providing that kind of escape from reality. So folklore may pursue a number of important functions, and that importance was recognized globally in 1982 in the UNESCO document Recommendation on the Safeguarding of Traditional Culture and Folklore. And through that document, folklore becomes officially recognized as a kind of intangible cultural heritage that is worth preserving or continuing. Just to continue with the autobiographical element, at the beginning of this project, I took a trip back to my home country, which is Scotland, to meet with folklorists and scholars of folklore to try and find out what was described as or associated with that word in Scotland in a more contemporary setting. Scotland is a place that has always been full of folklore, some of which has travelled abroad, figuratively for the most part, such as the Loch Ness Monster, or the Arthurian legends, banshees, kelpies, selkies, sea folk, seal folk. And this trip led me to realize that the benefit of the word folklore is also its drawback. And while I've described some canonical definitions of folklore in the literature and its uses, I've also found during this project that folklore can mean a lot of things beyond oral narration. Most of the scholars and writers whom I met gave a broad, permissive interpretation of that word. So folklore was taken to include this vast collection of things, texts, and practices. And this is by no means exhaustive. This is just indicative of particular conversations that I had at the time. So this brings us to digital folklore. Can folklore mean something digital? In the words of Gabriela de Seta, who has done extensive, very good work in this field, digital folklore describes, quote, the objects and practices emerging from the user's engagement with digital media platforms and computing applications. According to another prominent scholar, Gabriella Coleman, the meaning of digital folklore has broadened beyond its conventional associations to include digital media in its myriad forms and associated practices. So if we consider all of that which I just spoke about in terms of folklore, we didn't stop doing this just because we have the internet. In fact, the internet has served as a hearthstone for folklore, a means to propagate it further, to propagate existing stories further, and as an agent of change. And this is perhaps what's most of interest to me, is that the technology underpinning the transmission of these stories result in a shaping of those stories and a presentation of them that's different. And arguably the internet has been the greatest change in storytelling since the printing press. So the internet has preserved and digitized and circulated existing folklore, and it's also occasioned new forms of what we might call specifically digital folklore. And I have a number of examples here. Again, this is like by no means an exhaustive list. We might think, for example, of chain letters and hoaxes, which are transmitted in a similar means, which were once done in an ink on paper kind of way, and now circulate by email. The legends and beliefs which are archived and then debunked on Snopes.com may also exemplify this type of folklore. So it takes a different form, and interestingly and distinctively, much of internet folklore is actually what is called meta folklore. It's things like the rules of the internet, which are pasted here. It's folklore, about how we do folklore. And because of the nature of digital culture, very often this can be very self-referential and ironic. Digital folklore might also include the communications between internet groups such as online gamers or Instagram influencers or medical forums. Another example that's kind of pertinent to this talk is the phenomena of creepypasta. These are internet horror stories. And if you are of a sensitive disposition, I don't recommend that you read most of these. They are often featured alongside an image or video or audio that is shocking or disturbing. So I don't show any here because they genuinely are often disturbing. And the reason primarily for this is that means that they're more likely to go viral and to get clicked on, just as a particularly gruesome fairy tale was more likely to be told and retold in taverns hundreds of years ago. The name creepypasta comes from copypasta, which is internet slang for a block of text that gets copied and pasted over and over again from website to website. And this should sound familiar to our discussion of oral narration and folklore. The story isn't spoken out loud, of course, but in many other ways, it has a continuity with pre-digital folklore. It travels from one place to the next often being changed slightly in that process, sometimes majorly changed by a new storyteller set in a new context or addressed to a different audience. And as with legends, it's related as if it's true. Storytellers may tell an anecdote or retell something that allegedly just happened to the author. Or perhaps they'll describe a set of rituals or customs that if one follows, something incredible or terrible will happen. For example, a spirit will be conjured. And so we see continuities with the idea of popular antiquities, where rituals and customs and so-called superstitions align with fairy tales and parables and for other forms of narration. Another similarity that Creepypasta has with pre-digital folklore is that they're often very formulaic. And really it's the formula that we like and even come to expect. So while early folklorists had a difficult task of compiling from many sources, many of which were not published or recorded anywhere, digital folklore is often more traceable than other forms, more easily repeated. And records and caches of origin stories may still exist on the web. And so interested researchers can go back in and they can search back to the first writings of this history. It's important to say that this can happen often, but not always. And we sometimes expect digital technologies to be able to preserve things indefinitely. But the history of the internet is also a history of forgetting. Formats go out of date and websites get deactivated, or their subscriptions are not renewed, or they simply drop out of visibility because they are no longer ranked as highly as they were by automated search algorithms. But often with digital folklore, we can trace the ways these stories change over time and across space and place. So continuing with my biography, I became particularly interested in the last category of internet trolls. Now, that word troll obviously conjures up a particular image and imagination because we have been told a lot of folklore about trolls. And we might assume, like I initially did, that we use the word troll in digital culture as a continuation of the character from Norse mythology. So this quote, for example, is from an Icelandic saga, the Prose Edda. And when we think of an internet troll, we might be encouraged to imagine a monster like the one that's described or pictured here. But we never see these characters. Online trolling can be conducted under the cloak of anonymity without presenting an image or being able to choose what image of oneself one presents. The word troll as it's used in digital culture, etymologically speaking, is not from the creature that lived in caves, only occasionally wandering out and causing havoc in nearby human settlements. In fact, the term comes from fishing, and this can give us some insight into what is happening with the particular digital folklore of trolls. So trolling is a method of fishing whereby fishing lines with bait attached are dragged through the water in a speculative attempt to lure unsuspecting fish. The online troll similarly barbs his posts with tempting bait that will provoke the unsuspecting commentator to bite. So we might think, for example, of how the term clickbait has entered popular consciousness and the need and the necessity that's necessitated by the technology to garner attention at any opportunity. So our online existence that many of us will know very well is so crucially pinned to our ability to be seen and heard and reacted to and trolls exploit this vulnerability. The mistake might come from stereotypes of dedicated internet users as isolated and antisocial beings who occasionally break into our civilized areas of the internet and disrupt it. These are people who seem to lose their human form when they go online and become irrational and incomprehensible monsters. Unlike with other oral histories and legendary characters, however, the meaning of the name changes and popular usage of that word troll has changed in recent years. So in popular media, it's lost its specificity. A troll has become an abusive or malicious or disruptive presence of the internet of any kind, an impish, invariably malevolent, or at least a kind of prankish creature. When researchers do seek out these elusive figures, they find that they typically look like our friends and our colleagues. They look just like us. So we assume that something happens to people that transforms them into a monster online, just as some people turn angry and violent when they enter a car. As I mentioned, what trolls take advantage of is a property of digital folklore, namely virality, the capacity of a story to go viral. One of my favorite examples of viral digital folklore in recent years is Reddit's experiment, Our Place, which on April Fool's Day of 2017, Reddit gave its millions of anonymous users a blank canvas called Place. And there's a timeline of playing behind me at the moment. Each user could choose one pixel from 16 colors to place anywhere on the canvas, and then they had to wait a few minutes before placing another one. And out of no overall plan came this kind of protean shape-shifting creation of outsider art. As with any good folklore, we had competing interests, wars, battles, censorship, resistance, chaos, and order emerged out of this process. National flags, placed usually by citizens of that nation, appeared and grew and entered into border disputes with neighbors. There's a blue corner in the bottom right here, which is emerged, was countered by a politically left-leaning corner, a red corner of some kind, politically pragmatic and centrist green lattice party, which prioritized efficiency by placing only alternate squares and hence emulating their politics and their communal action in order to gain power over the canvas. All of these things were happening quite organically. There were corporate logos that emerged and sort of nostalgic designs of aging operating systems. And of the void, which is a black hole ripping slowly through the center of the canvas, appeared, which was standing for supposedly nihilism and erasure. It had aspects that were crass and destructive, like a lot of digital culture, but in some ways, Our Place is also a more hopeful story of collaboration. What Reddit created was a kind of storytelling that is unique to the technological affordances of social media and could not have been emulated without it. So that gives some background to this idea of digital folklore and how digital technologies have affected the retelling of folklore and the emergence of new forms. Some publications came out of our project, most notably this special issue in East Asian Science, Technology and Society, which I co-edited with Conor Graham and Alfred Montoya, and a couple of papers which the Malaysian historian Clarissa Lee and I wrote on internet trolling. We also held a conference at ARI, which explored the connections between film, scholarly, and artistic representations of folklore and digital folklore in Southeast Asia, which we called Writing the Internet. And Nancy Marrow-Flood and I organized a contemporaneous art exhibition as part of a series of biannual events that I've been running since 2016 called Techno Imaginations. So in preparation of this talk, I asked myself, well, what kind of digital folklore exists for Haw Par Villa? As many of you will know, Haw Par Villa is a syncretic patchwork of mythologies, religious instruction, morality tales, and it's embodied by over 1,000 sculptures, 150 dioramas, and a large maze of gardens. The novelist Catherine Lim called it a refuge from conventions. And I think that's a resonant phrase for this project. It was created by Aw Boon Haw with the intention to preserve Chinese morality and values, to serve as a means to, quote, edify and instruct the common folk, there's that word again, in Chinese morality. And Haw Par Villa, for us in this project, is an example of what architects call a visionary environment. It's a place that combines a singular, sometimes obsessive creator and an expanding collection of structures and items over time, typically fusing religious and moral messages. And we see these emerge in the region and elsewhere in the world. What these places have in common is that they are some combination of a singular obsessive creator. They often increase in size and intensity over time, surviving in tandem with their creator. Sometimes they're demolished by government authorities or hostile neighbors on the death of the creator, when there's no one left to vociferously advocate for it. And often they fuse religious, political, and moral messages together. They're syncretic and idiosyncratic, and typically the product of local craftsmen or amateur enthusiasts. They can sometimes be called gaudy or kitsch or ostentatious, as well as moralistic, pious, and political. Being dependent on one person, the destruction of these visionary environments and the potential elimination of their memory is always a real threat. And this is where the conversation on digitization is perhaps most fiercely relevant. For us, the idea of a visionary environment is something that's quite ambiguous. So for Haw Par Villa, the park is to some extent, to a large extent, the product of an individual mind, a visionary. But this term also calls to mind the significance of vision, the look of the park, and our act of looking while we were in the park, which is essential to its meaning and to one's memory of it. So in our project, we take very seriously and have a lot of appreciation for the craftsmanship that has gone into creating this incredibly visceral experience. At Haw Par Villa, visitors frequently bring cameras. One can find many of their images on social media or from visiting the homes of Singaporean families. These pictures, which are taken from innumerable viewpoints, add up to a huge repository of digital folklore, recording the park's history. At the same time, one is not forced or even encouraged to follow a particular path around Haw Par Villa, unless you take a guided tour. It's notable that there are few signposts and no obvious route from one loosely defined zone to another. And what we notice is that because of the way the statues are created, changing one's perspective of them, standing at a different angle, can provide a different interpretation of the scene. So Haw Par Villa follows in the tradition of a learning garden, a park whose purpose is to educate and inculcate a moral and social ethic. And it has also been described as a sculptural sketchbook, a corporeal form of storytelling through objects. If we look at the scenes of the park, they appear like studio scenery, which are temporarily frozen. The statues have an unsettling expressiveness, as if they'd been paused partway through an action. And as my collaborator noted after one of our trips, when you lift your camera to take a picture, you realize that each perspective, each framing that you impose modifies the expression of those statues and transforms the scene. So rather than prescribing one interpretation, the scenes submit themselves to the eye of the viewer and offer the possibility of new interpretations. Aubrey Haw himself is said to have begun and ended each day with folklore. He would walk around the gardens with his craftsmen, recounting myths and legends that he wanted to be added to the park. He would listen to folkloric stories on the radio to remind himself of things that he wanted to include. And in an interview with a biographer who described himself as a transmitter of knowledge, someone whose task it was to clarify and pass on that which came before. Haw Par Villa is no longer one of Singapore's top attractions. It's been supplanted by engineering spectacles like Gardens by the Bay or the Singapore Zoo or Universal Studios. And today the park can sometimes stand empty or largely empty, visited only by occasional tourists or families, passers-by who are cutting through on their way to the local train station. One of my former students, Lee Man Yi, who worked with us on this project, was tasked with going out to survey visitors. And one challenge that we had was that quite small numbers of people would show up, and even smaller numbers would want to stop and talk to a researcher in a largely unsheltered and hilly environment. In a letter to the Straits Times in 2015, the heritage and community correspondent Melody Zacchius suggested that Haw Par Villa was viewed as a, quote, theme park past its prime, struggling to find its relevance in modern Singapore. There are echoes with older comments which are less circumspect. So an editorial from 1979 reads, "It may not be an image about what we are particularly proud, it has no distinctive value, historical value, but it certainly has a remarkably distinctive style. Not everyone may care for the color scheme or the themes of the tableau or the quality of the figure work, but where else can the Singaporean and the foreigner find such a rich and sometimes vulgar representation of man's imagination, dreams, and fears?" The editorial stated that the park was, quote, "not exactly a national treasure or what most Singaporeans regard as part of their nation's heritage. Instead, it sectioned it off as part of the tourist experience and of young people's growing up." And much of the discussions surrounding Haw Par Villa over the course of its life have revolved around its threatened existence and its place, with headlines covering the park's precarious status in Singapore, STB making every effort to keep Haw Par Villa alive, breathe new life into Haw Par Villa, saving Haw Par Villa from certain death. Should Haw Par Villa be spiced up while retaining its cultural roots, or be redeveloped into something different? And that phrase "spiced up" occurs in a number of comments. But a study conducted by Peggy Teo and Lim Hyung Lee found that 80% of respondents responded positively to the question of whether Haw Par Villa should be conserved. Of this number, 60% believed that Haw Par Villa should be conserved as an important part of Singapore's cultural heritage and history. In our project, we suggest that the park itself is a recording. Having been largely destroyed in the Second World War and going through many transformations since, what we see today is a new imagination of the park that builds on top of earlier versions or variants. Dioramas are replaced and supplemented. Sometimes they travel to other parts of Singapore. New pathways are created, new exhibits, layers of paint and remodeling are added to statues over time, and they're replaced with new statues. Much of this is recorded in the physical place and in digital records, but some is sadly lost forever. There have been many attempts to record Haw Par Villa digitally to preserve information relating to the park so that it won't be lost. And for example, there is of course the digital sharing of photographs, and vicariously we see the memories and the changing architecture of the park. The National Library has digitized a huge collection of photographs. But there's also a lot of more informal sharing going on, such as on the Friends of Haw Par Villa Facebook page, where users share images from their personal collections and memories from their own lives. And in 2019, there was a concerted effort by the Collective Memory Project to collect and digitize personal photographs, particularly from the 1965 to 85 period. And there's now a documentary film about the park featuring the longtime head artisan Teovio Seng. Haw Par Villa has also appeared in feature films, contemporary local horror film, as well as older movies. It's appeared in music videos, usually in the background to some exciting action. And these records serve as a kind of history, even though the park may only be an incidental location. Its Hong Kong cousin has appeared in video games such as Super Street Fighter 2 and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which are pictured here. These digital recordings are part of the digital folklore of Haw Par Villa and its place in digital culture. There are numerous ghost stories that circulate and change, sometimes originate online. It was, of course, a site of war, which are often the location for ghost stories, and structures like the 10 Courts of Hell possibly lend themselves to such stories, some of which suggest that the spirits or ghouls will remain in the park and the possessed statues, which further emphasizes the point that these statues are perceived to be vivid and imaginative and alive. And these stories are shared excitedly by enthusiasts on forums and YouTube channels, such as the one pictured here. There are also numerous efforts to digitize the physical appearance of the park. So some researchers are interested in digitally recreating Haw Par Villa using drone footage in order to faithfully recreate a digital version of the park that can then be experienced. The music makers, music producers, Oh Money Pay Money, have animated particular statues for a music video, which I'm just playing at the moment to give you an idea of their work. And I can skip. Others have used photogrammetrical techniques to create 3D models to share with 3D printing communities, so you can print out your favorite statue. And this is what we might call a digitization or a recreation of the park in a virtual space. And there's a certain authenticity to those projects. The result is as far as technically possible and within the resources available to create something that's realistic. But these attempts to authentically recreate aspects of the park seem to miss something as well. One key finding from our fieldwork, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly so that we can finish not too far over the time. One key finding was that for many visitors, the park was strongly associated with childhood and the idea of play and mimicry. A faithful recreation may not always capture that. Haw Par Villa is not just a place to visit and to receive information, it's also a place where people, usually children, but not only children, play. Visitors imitate the poses of statues and they run from one space to another, they climb onto the statues, they hide in warrens and so on. And notice that when you search for Haw Par Villa online, the Wikipedia page will come up and it will describe it, I think erroneously, as a theme park. It was, of course, also a theme park when it was renamed Haw Par Villa Dragon World, and it had entrance fees, which were introduced for I think the first time in its history, animatronics and a water ride and so on. But there's also a more free-form sense of play, which seems to be exemplified in the seemingly undirected nature of a visit to the park. As I mentioned, there are few rules, few signposts showing one how to walk around the park. And so people tend to move, taking different routes or to different places of interest. And in so doing, as a visitor, you engage in what seems most natural in the presence of statues that are approximately the height of a person and whose access has not been impeded. And you interact with them and you pose with them and you imitate them. Sometimes this sense of play has been taken up explicitly by the park's managers. So in a move to attract more visitors to the park, Haw Par Villa's operator Journeys opened the park to a large-scale outdoor adventure game in 2016, which led participants to discover the park as they solved different puzzles. And more recently, Haw Par Villa has been the source of inspiration for the Singapore Chinese Cultural Centre's Youth Festival art exhibition, with a installation that was created through the collaboration of various artists. Our project, which is called Recording Haw Par Villa, or REC HPV, has a different end than some of these efforts to digitize Haw Par Villa. This project is more in line with another pronunciation of that word, recreation, not recreation, but recreation. It tries to preserve some element of play within a reimagining of the park. And at the heart of the project is the technique of photogrammetry, a digital technical technique. I may skip over what I was going to explain as the history of photogrammetry, but very briefly, etymologically, photogrammetry is the science of making measurements from photographs. And it has precursors in early experimentations in optics and geometry and stereoscopy and of course photography. But its origins lie in geographical surveying and the use of photographs to make topographic maps like this one. The term was introduced by the German geographer Otto Kirsten, as time went on, surveyors progressed to use stereoscopic photographs to create ever more accurate reliefs of the land. As with many technologies and techniques, the First and Second World Wars provided significant developments in the foundations of mathematics and photography and computational methods that allowed for more sophisticated methods to emerge. And today, photogrammetry is most prominently a digital technique. And it can be extremely sophisticated and can be used to create hyper-realistic images that can then be manipulated. So it's used, for example, in sports to tell if a player is offside or a ball has crossed the line in association football. What happens is that an object, whether it's a small object like a football or even a football stadium, can be scanned, taking many, maybe thousands of photographs from as many angles as possible. So for our project, this involved taking a very long selfie stick in blistering heat and many hours in Haw Par Villa, photographing the various statues and environments, and then applying principles of geometry. So each photograph is a point in space which can then be mapped in 3 dimensions, and software can be used to identify points between 2 or more photos and possibly using other information about the photograph to compile a model. This could be done on a standard computer. However, it's very resource intensive. So unlike digital photography, a typical reconstruction can take from minutes to several days for a single object or a scene. In a commercial setting, it has many advantages. So despite those high computational demands, it can be relatively easy, fast, cheap, and accurate way to obtain measurements or other information compared with more traditional methods. One can send a drone over an otherwise difficult to reach location and therefore prevent putting people at risk. And it's also used in a lot of different engineering, forensic science, film and computer games, and so on. A key goal of at least some digital heritage is to preserve cultural heritage that has either been lost or is in danger of being lost. But it can also recognize that cultural heritage is always changing and that digital technologies afford new possibilities beyond the narrow idea of preservation. So Anne-Marie Sullivan writes that the transformations in how cultural collections are preserved, communicated, viewed, experienced, and consumed have expanded with the development of new media. And for this project, the technology makes an irreducible contribution to the final result. Through this project, we wish to explore the technologies that are used to digitize heritage. What are their limits? What new media and forms do they produce? What artifacts do they create in the process? What happens when such processes and techniques go wrong, seemingly go wrong? That can also be interesting and provocative and generative of ideas. Sometimes the images produced by photogrammetry produce something that's hazy and an incomplete memory of the park. If the stories portrayed in the park are the expression of a collective memory, it's also possible to establish certain formal analogies on an individual level between the way the park is organized and with our own psychological memory of it. So like the memory of an individual, Haw Par Villa is a heterogeneous patchwork of stories, a collection of archetypal figures belonging to different eras, places, and contexts. And through this process, artifacts may arise in poor resolution, occlusion and clutter, noise and infidelities. Like our own biological memories, the creations produced by photogrammetry are varying in their degrees of fidelity and produce strange and uncanny artifacts. So Haw Par Villa is a place where cultural transmission takes place in a sculptural form, and the scenes of the park are visual and tactile, often largely absent of text, calling in the first place the imagination of those who look at them. And objects here, scenes and sculptures have the capacity to bring out memories. Fittingly, photogrammetry can also have a sculptural nature, and in some cases the reconstruction, in a sense, fails. It feels like it just came out of its mold, like the material has stuck, it didn't come out properly. And the appearance of these kinds of artifacts are that of sculptural objects. And as with sculpture, the post-production process involves a lot of cleaning and polishing and removing bits of the environment that one may not want to include. Due to the way that photogrammetry works, it also raises interesting questions about framing. What is part of the image that is preserved and what is not? With photography, there is a framing that is imposed by the camera, by the person who's taking the picture. But for a photogrammetric image, these pictures are not taken for human consumption, but for the consumption of the algorithm. And the frame that results is partly a result of what the algorithm chooses to include. So in a sense then, what gets selected is an automated process rather than something that's created by human hands. Digital technologies, after all, translate information and encode it in particular ways. There's no such thing as a perfect replication in this sphere. And at one level, photogrammetry can be thought of as a copying device. But that process of copying also mathematically manipulates and compiles many different perspectives of what it is photographing. So rather than present a rupture when moving to a virtual environment, we think that there are also many continuities. The technique may capture elements of the park that would escape a photorealistic copy. Haw Par Villa is, as was quoted before, a refuge from convention. It exists as a site of multiple identities. And it's an important heritage site among our Southeast Asian learning gardens with symbolic and cultural connections. And it has become a place around which digital folklore has emerged and continues to grow. And this then feeds back into perceptions of the place of the park in Singapore today. That concludes this talk. Feel free to write to me if you want to know anything about the future developments of this project. It's something that is a work in progress. Or if you want to know more about my work on digital folklore. And let's look forward to the reopening of the physical version of the park on July the 1st. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope I've left some time for questions.
Thanks so much, Dr. Eric. I think it was quite an interesting trajectory of your talk, from looking at what we conventionally see in pop culture about the the way that digital lore is currently constructed and then relating that to heritage. I think in relation to the previous talks that have been scheduled for this speaker series, it's also quite interesting to see how you integrated the tangible aspect of heritage with this more intangible aspect that comes about from digital media and digitalization. Yeah, so I think we will go straight into the Q&A section. I will stop your sharing right now so that I can just show the Q&A etiquette. Okay, so please do put in your questions in the Q&A tab, and we will address them one by one. And we may not have enough time to address all of them, but as Eric has already placed his email, please feel free to also direct your questions to us or to Eric. All right. So we have one of the first questions, perhaps more related to the process that you've had. I think this question came from the chat from Claire Herford. Just curious, how many models were you able to photograph? Maybe talk a bit more about the process itself and the methodology.
Sure. So it's a shame that Olivier couldn't be here to join us because he'd be able to talk about that, of course. But if the question is about how much of the park was covered, well, I think that we photographed all of the park to some extent. As I mentioned, it's a technique that involves a certain amount of resources, so it can take several days to compile one model. And it is, of course, a challenge to go out to the park and to take those photographs. So Olivier in particular spent a lot of time with the longest selfie stick in the world, probably looking quite suspicious, taking images from as many different angles of the objects and sculptures and dioramas as possible. And then making some decisions about, what should be included in the project. So one of the early models was of the Garuda, which you see when you pretty soon after you enter the park. And we showed this at a conference a few years ago and animated it. And yeah, I mean, I think I pass the question back to Claire and ask her like exactly what she wants to know more about. But if it's a question about what techniques are involved, then it's the taking of large numbers of photographs and then the creation of a bespoke algorithm piece of software that can then process them in order to produce a particular model that can then be manipulated in lots of different ways. It can be zoomed in and out of, it can be rotated. So in a sense, you have something that is richer or like provides for a different form of vision, a different form of seeing than photography, which is a static image that frames an object in a particular way.
Okay, thank you. I think Claire mentioned that they will email you directly. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I think it's quite interesting, especially in the images that you provided, that there is the background is black. So what you really focus on is actually just the sculptures, which can be a different way of seeing it as compared to being there and then taking it all in at the same time, including the background or the landscape as well.
Yeah, so I suppose the other thing to mention about that is that, yes, it includes the sculptures, but one of the things that was of most interest to us was how different aspects of the environment get included in that process. So we tend to think of those sculptures as being isolated artifacts, and they get moved around and replaced and taken out and rebuilt and so on. But they are situated in a particular context, and one of the interesting effects of photogrammetry is that because it's produced in a partly automated way, it also includes elements of the environment. The software, the algorithm doesn't know what is as part of the sculpture and what is part of the environment always. So what you end up with is a sculpture that is in part situated.
It's really interesting. And it relates to one of the questions that was asked in our Q&A tab. I'm not sure if you have seen this. There is a section of Haw Par Villa known as the graveyard, where statues are retired and put to rest. Would you consider that the removal of such statues means that, metaphorically, these narratives no longer have a place and are superseded by other more contemporary folklore?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question. And there are, of course, many statues and elements of the park that one might not traditionally include as folklore, but I think that we should. For example, there was a Statue of Liberty, there were Disney figures, and if you look back in the history of folklore, you also see, for example, advertisements and commercial products as part of popular antiquity. So I think that we should not draw a fine distinction between those elements of folklore that we consider to be more contemporary. Partly that's a result of our association of folklore with something that's pre-modern, which I think is not true. As I was talking about at the beginning, I think that we continue to tell stories and that they do change, but there are also continuities. And one of the reasons why digitization, in the sense of like faithfully preserving these artifacts, is so important is because at any moment they can be lost. The statue is a physical object that degrades over time, and some of these decisions are taken where they can't be repaired. I don't know what the artistic consideration is there, but I suppose at some point the statue is just degraded to such an extent that it can't be put back in the park. So I think that this makes those processes of digitization and perhaps also our project of trying to imagine new ways of seeing the sculptures, it makes it relevant.
Thank you. We'll move to the next question by Joshua, who would like you to elaborate a bit more about the element of play that visitors recall when we brought into the photogrammetrical reproduction of the park.
Yes, that's an excellent point. So as I was talking about how I think that we think that Haw Par Villa is a playful environment. It's a place where people play, and that opens up a question of, well, what do we mean by play? And for me, play is something that is unconventional and by its nature disorganized. So there are forms of organized entertainment, and we might want to call them play, but there's another kind of play that emerges spontaneously through one's interaction with one's environment. And it seems to me that Haw Par Villa is in part constructed in order to afford that sense of play. It's possible to step onto some of the constructions and interact with them and take photographs with them. So it seems to, in its physical arrangement, afford play. How that might be brought into a photogrammetrical reproduction lies in the manipulability of photogrammetry. It's possible to tweak the processes and the algorithms, and that's something that allows one to intervene in the technology and to test its limits and to explore its possibilities. So rather than aiming at using a technology in order to reproduce something, and considering it an engineering problem, one can use these technologies to probe their possibilities and see when they break down. And sometimes in that breaking down, one gets an insight into the nature of what one's studying that can be more true than you would get through a photograph.
Thank you, and thanks for the question as well. I think there are quite a few more questions, so we might try to combine some of them according to the theme. So there are two questions that kind of address the role of an institution in helping to make available these folklores. So one question from the anonymous attendee about what efforts would you see institutions and everyday individuals to reanimate and re-engage cultural living artifacts? And similar to that, another question in the chat that goes, if you do not need to search or trawl for this folklore, will it still be folklore if it's easily accessible to all?
Yeah, these are great questions. So if I take the second one first, folklore is a popular medium. It's meant to be consumed by large numbers of people. So the fact that digital technology makes it more accessible, I think just solidifies its status as a kind of folklore. And what's interesting is how it not only replicates those stories, but also allows them to change in different ways and to be embedded in different contexts. So I've said elsewhere that I don't very much like the term the internet, because I think that actually there are multiple internets and multiple digital cultures, and digital infrastructure are adopted and adapted and used and made accessible in different ways in different places. And so making it more accessible, making it more trawlable, gives actually more flexibility to interpretation and allows for different possibilities. So that people can bring their own interpretations and stories to those particular elements of folklore. Can you point me to the first question again?
It's right at the bottom by the anonymous attendee in the question and answer tab.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm very much an outsider to Haw Par Villa, so I'm wary of making prescriptions. I can talk about my own experience of the park, but in terms of what should be done in order to reanimate it, well, I think that we've seen in much of the popular discourse about the park that is a concern. Like, the idea is that it needs to be reanimated and to breathe new life into it, for example. But if we go to the park, it's quite clear that the artistic works there are full of life, and that Haw Par Villa is also very lively and always changing and morphing into new forms. It's currently undergoing renovation, and it will take some new form with new affordances. So my own instinct is to say that it is currently animated, and we can give some other explanation as to why it's not as popularly attended as other tourist locations or other sites of heritage in Singapore. And I think that there are scholars who give explanations of that, which I can point you to if you're interested.
Thank you. We'll have the last two questions before closing off this session. So I think the last question that we just talked about is also partially answered with Jasmine's question about what's the future of the villa. So we'll move on to the other two questions about more in generally how digital folklore on the internet is gone about. So I think from Rachel Agatha O, the question is, would the cultural variety of folklore be significantly less since internet content seems to be very American-centric?
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point, in the sense that we sometimes think of the internet as monolingual and monocultural. The internet has, of course, changed dramatically over the last couple of decades from something that was largely curated by hobbyists and amateurs, or maybe this is predating the last couple of decades, to something that is dominated by corporations and commercial interests, and has a particular logic according to which different websites and therefore different stories get circulated and become visible to others. So it's certainly true that a lot of internet content can be dominated by, for example, American-based companies, multinational corporations, and the content will be restricted in that sense. At the same time, it's not that there isn't other material out there. Of course there is, but the way that we are encouraged by the technology to use the internet pushes us towards certain content and away from others. So if one is interested, then one needs to make a concerted effort to buck those kinds of pushes and nudges. And there's a structural answer to that question as well, but that's at the individual level. In the near term, I suppose that's the thing that one should do, is to search out other kinds of content and to promote it as much as possible.
Right. It's also related to the second question, right, about state corporate forces, as you mentioned, multinational companies. So yeah, I think having that aspect of searching for it, or from the ground up kind of like interaction with the digital realm could also be one of the solutions, as you briefly kind of touched on. Okay, so that is really all for the question and answer session. Thanks everyone for putting in your questions, and thank you as well, Eric, for helping to process a lot of these thoughts that have come about through your presentation. So that is all the time that we have for today's talk. As mentioned earlier, this is part of the APRU University Museums Research Symposium series that will happen at the end of the year. So please do either participate in this symposium or submit something for the symposium if you are interested in it. And we also have a feedback form, so please do add in your feedback if you have any comments for us in our series and programming at the Baba House. Other than that, this is really, thank you so much for sticking with us through the entire series of the Heritage Conservation Speaker Series. And thank you to Dr. Eric Kirk for your very interesting talk and for engaging the questions that were asked. Thank you to the audience for tuning in as well. And we hope to see you at a future Baba House program. Thank you.
Thank you.